Greetings and salutations, loyal viewers of this channel. My name is Sean, and today we got to talk about this new study that recently dropped that seems to indicate that teenagers that were subject to the COVID-19 lockdowns actually had significant wear and tear on their brain. It is being reported that they've aged up in terms of their brain faster than normal teenagers in previous generations, and while this is impacting young male teenagers, it's actually significantly worse for young female teenagers. And I think it is important for us to point this out because if you'll remember, because Lord Anthony Fauci said lockdowns were the way to go, nobody was allowed, and you would in fact get banned off of social media for saying and restricted and censored in all these different ways that the COVID lockdowns might have significantly higher consequences than the actual pandemic itself. And you would also get in trouble, you would also be restricted if you pointed out that people under the age of 18, school-age children, were in the least affected by the virus group, thus locking them down and keeping them out of school was not a sensible policy for us to have. Well, it turns out, at least according to this study, the consequences might be devastating, and that's what we got to talk about today. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
We want to turn now to new research that's raising concerns about teen mental health. The study found that COVID lockdowns and stay-at-home orders caused stress that aged teenage brains prematurely, and teen girls were more impacted by this than teen boys.
So I just want to start off by saying that I am not a scientist. I, in no way, shape, or form, am qualified to analyze brain scans or anything like that, so I'm heavily relying on the reporting, on the summation from the people who are conducting the study, but what I can tell you is how this ended up coming into being. So there was already a brain study that was initiated for kids in and around the teenage age. And what ended up happening was in 2018, they came in and received MRIs, which are magnetic brain scans, and we ended up getting images for them, and they were supposed to come in the subsequent following years for follow-up scans. However, the lockdowns ended up happening. The scans ended up being canceled, and whatever they were going to study prior to the lockdowns ended up changing in 2021/2022 when these teenagers ended up showing up, and the doctors or the researchers ended up looking at their brain scans, and they noticed that the cerebral cortex was thinner than they expected, and dramatically so. And this is associated more with aging, which is why you're going to hear about the aging of people's brains.
Well, Alex, I can tell you, as we age, the cerebral cortex, that's that gray matter around our brain, it thins over time. And stress, what's called toxic stress, can actually accelerate the thinning, which is associated with an increased risk of anxiety, depression, and other behavioral disorders. And that is why what researchers in Washington found is not good.
So like that lady just broke down, this thinning of the cerebral cortex has devastating potential consequences. It puts you at greater risk for Alzheimer's and all sorts of disorders, depression, and all of that. And unfortunately, the data already showed us that women, young girls, teenagers, were experiencing these mental issues at a significantly higher clip than previous generations. And men were as well, but it's not as dramatic as women.
When we saw the difference between the boys and the girls, I think that's the shocking result. If you look at the figures showing which brain areas are involved, in girl teens, it's all over the brain, both hemispheres, all lobes, it's everywhere. Whereas in boys, it's only occipital cortex, meaning visual cortex. Two little areas.
Now, there are many a reason why we see the difference in the affected areas of the brain and the level of affectedness on the brain between boys and girls. And obviously, the first reason is that boys and girls are inherently different, something that our modern culture tends to deny over and over again. But one of the ways that they appear to be different, or they are demonstrated to be different, is that women, teenagers, all women, are actually more interested in building themselves up through social relationships. So the lockdowns in particular were damaging to them because they cut off and or reduce those relationships. And I need to remind you once again that the data showed us from the jump very early on that teenagers, people under the age of 18, were not significantly at risk for the virus. This is why certain countries opened up schools immediately, and a bunch of different states also followed suit. So what we're looking at is brain damage, and I would love love to see the data on this between states that did the lockdowns that kept kids out of school versus states that didn't do that. That would really tell us the negative impacts of these policies, because we are in the United States of America. We have 50 laboratories of innovation, and sometimes states right next to each other would do completely polar opposite lockdown policies. But yeah, it had an impact. It was something to be concerned about. And the fact of the matter is, this trust the science religious devotion to Anthony Fauci ended up leading to all of these negative consequences that we are still going to be discovering for years to come. And it's absolutely shameful. Again, you should have been able to question this the whole time. It shouldn't have been a ban-worthy offense to point out that the government and their scientists might be wrong, and that these lockdowns were probably more about politics than anything, because pro-lockdown governors ended up getting very positive media coverage, while people like Ron DeSantis, even though he was reading the research related to this more reportedly than Governor Andrew Cuomo, ended up getting ripped apart by the media.
And this is the image, you see it right here, that the study co-author is referring to. You can see the aging throughout the brains of teenage girls, but only in 2 small areas for boys. Now, the brain scans of girls showed accelerated aging of more than 4 years compared to 1.4 years for boys.
So right there, they end up breaking down the number of years that would be aged off in girls versus boys. And while for boys, you hear 1.4 years of brain matter loss, what you end up seeing for girls is around 4 years of aging of their brain. And they throw out the prospect that maybe, just maybe, there is a way for their brains to recover, but unfortunately, that is not the case. Unfortunately, your cerebral cortex does not get thicker, it just thins, and it can thin faster or slower, but it doesn't go in reverse.
So the big question you might be asking now is, can teen brains recover from this?
We don't expect that the brains would get thicker again, because as I said, the biological process over time is it's always going to thin. But recovery might look like a slowdown in the rate of thinning. So as, particularly for girls, their social worlds come back, the pandemic recedes, and we really feel that life is more back to normal. Then you might expect to see that, yes, there's thinning, but it's not quite as fast.
So the doctor repeats what I just told you about how the cerebral cortex is always thinning, it does not thicken, but she throws out a potential option for recovery, which of course would be that the brain ends up thinning at a slower rate in order to compensate for the acceleration. But the fact of the matter is, this is nonsense in my very unscientific opinion, and here's why. So just looking at this from a mathematical point of view, in order to compensate for the 4 years lost in teenage girls' brains, essentially what you would have to do is slow it down by half over the course of 8 years. Because again, it is always thinning, it is just dependent on the speed. And we're not talking about slowing it down by half from that 4-year clip, because that would still be 2 years over the course of lockdown, which was about 1+ years in the United States of America. It would have to be done 50% from what is normal. So all of a sudden, their brains would have to bounce back and become extra healthy comparatively. And to me, that does not sound like a likely proposition. To me, it sounds like these women are going to have to suffer years early all the different negative consequences of an aging brain, which include anxiety, depression, earlier risk for Alzheimer's, and all that. And for what? What did we end up achieving? There were not a lot of teenagers that were dying from the virus anyway, but instead of actually balancing out the risk versus the reward, we decided to go crazy as a country in many of these left-wing places, and this is what we're left with. We're left with all of these different teenagers, and again, if this ends up proving out true as something that they're going to experience broadly across the country, at risk for all these different other ailments that kick in later in life, but for them are going to be earlier than previous generations.
So the question many of you at home may be asking right now, what can parents and caregivers, even teachers and friends, what can they do as we now have more evidence of a teen mental health crisis?
So I know there's a lot of concern about this, and there very well should be as of right now. I think it is important for us to understand the scientific process and also not become like the left, where we just do this scientism thing, where we take things that end up lining up with our preconceived notions and put them out there as objective fact. Because as of right now, this is one study that was originally not intended needed to discover what this actually discovered. And make no mistake about it, this woman's research team, after publishing these results, are going to be flooded with a bunch of different grant money and all these other things, even though if these students come from the same region, the same area, this could be a situation where there's a coinciding environmental impact that these teenagers are dealing with. So what we actually need to do before this is proven out is compare the teenagers in COVID lockdown states to teenagers in non-COVID lockdown states, and also compare the brain scans that show us the thinning of the cerebral cortex from previous generations from in and around this time to the current generation. That way we will understand how much of this was stress due to specifically strict lockdowns versus stress due to the overall stress related to the pandemic. But most importantly, what we need to do going forward is never forget about this. Never forget about the consequences of lockdowns. Never forget about how they were forced upon us, and call out all of the institutions that aided and abetted people like Anthony Fauci, people like the lefty governors that kept the lockdowns going for far too long, because they always use the shield of censorship and scientism in order to defend their policies, when the fact of the matter is they had no idea what the hell they were doing, which wouldn't be a problem if you allowed people to experiment and make their own choices, but they didn't allow that. They instead enforced their will upon all of us, and now parents of teenagers and teenagers themselves are suffering the consequences for that. Also, it would be interesting for us to look at the brain scans of people who are not teenagers so we can see if they were able to deal with the stress, or if that also, in addition to this, caused their brains to have significant problems. Because one of the things that is very true about this pandemic is that a lot of people have become lost to us for a very long time. They're still in that COVID crazy camp, and it's not likely that they're ever going to be able to recover. I mean, there's a whole other issue that I don't want to get into where people have their symptoms for a long time, and the reason I'm avoiding that is because those people tend to be absolutely crazy in the comments of videos that question them, ask anything about that, and I do believe that that is due in large part to the fact that they are obsessed with the virus. But that is what is going on in the United States of America. This is what we're discovering day by day by day. And one of the things that I told you back when the lockdowns originally started is that we're not going to know the full extent of this or have a picture of the full extent of the damage of this until about 5 years out. Well, the lockdown started in 2020. We are on year 4. And if you want to count it as year 3, because they didn't really finish up until around 2021. So we don't know, and we're not going to know for a little while longer, but expect different various research results to get significantly worse. And remind all the influencers that are going to report on this story, that advocated for the lockdown, that said that actually doing a herd immunity strategy was killing everybody for the economy, what they did, what they advocated for, who they were during this period of time, and never trust them ever again. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. If you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about how the lockdowns damage teenagers' brains. Till next time.